Thanks, Seb. Thank you, and congrats on this amazing stuff. And I know you told me the other day also we have more people coming today than you did last year and the year before, so onwards and upwards, really amazing. Thanks to the ACMI team for helping out with everything. My name's Dan Hill, you can drop the professor. Seb, you've known me for 30 years probably. Anyway, Dan Hill, Director of Melbourne School of Design at University of Melbourne. And I also want to acknowledge the country that we're on, the land that we're on, pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, particularly Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, where we are and where we work at Melbourne Uni as well, and Bunurong people and Yorta Yorta, and many others around our campuses. It's my pleasure to do a little short intro for Deb Chachra, who's the keynote speaker today. And before I get into talking about Deb, I just want to start with a text actually by Amberline Quay Molina, who's a Palaku writer from sort of Western Australia way. And she wrote this article in the 2005 Indigenous Law Bulletin, which I'm sure you're all avid readers of. And it's called Seeing the Light, Aboriginal Law, Learning and Sustainable Living in Country. And there's a little excerpt in there at the start. And she wrote, "The pattern that makes the whole is in each thread, and all the threads together make the whole. Stand close to the pattern and you can focus on a single thread. Stand a little further back and you can see how that thread connects to others. Stand further back still and you can see it all. And it's only once you see it all that you recognize the pattern of the whole in every individual thread. The whole is more than the sum of the parts, and the whole is in all of its parts." You can read that quote from many angles, I guess. We might hear, obviously, a distillation of Indigenous cultures, as we also just heard about from Tony, that intrinsic systemic capability, the idea of reciprocity at numerous scales, of the indivisible nature of country. With my non-Indigenous background in design, technology, and culture, I also hear design practice, I hear about ideas of assemblage, I hear about even the inheritance of object-oriented programming, perhaps, if I can not draw too long a bow, about how we might be trying to turn a design school inside out or a museum like this inside out to connect and thread together across disciplines, across bodies of knowledge, across society, and so on. And we might also see parallels in the zooming back and forth between these individual scales, cultures, systems in Deb Chatra's work. That sense that our individual touch points, such as interactions around water or power utilities or freeways, are simultaneously part of interconnected and interdependent local, municipal, regional, and global systems and flows. You can hear all of those echoes in Deb's extraordinary, brilliant book, How Infrastructure Works, Transforming Our Shared Systems for a Changing World, which I'll no doubt draw from in a minute. I'm really delighted we've got Deb here today to share some of this thinking, this super important thinking for us here in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, and beyond. The bio bit, Deb Chachra is Professor of Engineering at Olin College of Engineering outside Boston in Massachusetts. She works at the intersection of technology and culture with a focus on infrastructure and the built environment, design, equity and inclusion, education, particularly engineering. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Time, Guardian. Research has been supported by awards from the National Science Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, Autodesk Foundation, and many others. And prior to joining Olin, Deb held a postdoctoral fellowship at MIT and received undergraduate and graduate degrees in engineering from the University of Toronto. And it's a rare talent, drawn from all of that amazing background and many other things in her life, which you'll hear about if you read the book, that can make a book about infrastructure so interesting, actually, and so valuable and thought-provoking. And to my mind, it's one of the best, wisest books about infrastructure and technologies that one could read. But it's more than that. It's about culture as well, as you'll hear. Deb points out how these systems make manifest our ability to cooperate, to meet universal needs and care for each other, which is fairly fundamentally also related to culture, both in both senses of that complex word, everyday life and the way we live together, as well as cultural production, art, how we express ourselves. And that's what makes infrastructure actually meaningful as well. In Australia, our infrastructural systems like energy, mobility, housing, and I deliberately put housing in the list as an infrastructure, define our reality, our prosperity, and our everyday life. And sadly, they reveal we've got a lot of work to do in terms of care at scale. Recent research by Climate Analytics finds that Australian fossil fuel experts rank second only to Russia for climate damage, with no meaningful plan for reduction at all. We continue to issue permits for the expansion of, just last year, 3 enormous mines and 9 permits for further gas explorations. This is Australia enabling infrastructural damage at global scale. Closer to home, things like utes and SUVs make up the entire top 10 car sales in Australia. You might think, so what? This is completely anomalous by any standards. Our transport emissions growth since 2000 has increased by 20%, whereas almost every equivalent country, it has decreased. Even similarly large petrostates, if I can call them that, like Canada, the US, and Norway have gone down by 3%, 9%, and 10% respectively. UK has been reduced it by 25%, Japan by 30%, and so on. Ours has gone the other way. Australia's the only one that's increased it. And it's not a case of just switching those to electric, of course, even if we could do that anytime soon. Almost all analysis shows that if we just did that and switched those petrol engines to electric engines, we wouldn't have enough materials globally to facilitate such a transition, and the cost of producing all those materials and digging them up in the first place and processing them would also push us over the edge anyway in terms of climate emissions. So perhaps even more fundamentally, studies have shown that children involved in a fatal crash are 8 times more likely to have been struck by an SUV than a standard car. So Deb reminds us when we make these choices as both individuals and as a society that we're saying something about culture and infrastructure and what we stand for, what we believe in. Stafford Beer had this memorable line that the purpose of a system is what it does. And this statistic alone about kids should make us wonder what the purpose of Australian infrastructure is. And finally, it's not about emissions and deaths and mines and things like that, or just about those things. Of course, it is about those things, but the infrastructures the choices we make about that, then they produce certain kinds of neighborhoods, certain kinds of cities, certain kinds of politics, and those infrastructures produce social isolation, insularity, a sense of individuality over the common good, and so on. So, as Tony pointed out, we've got some serious decisions to make in the next year or so about what we stand for as a place. And that links to these everyday decisions about things like energy and driving and neighborhoods and gardens and all of these things, and everything around us. So it's all culture, ultimately. So it's fundamentally revealing. Deb writes that infrastructure is inextricable from culture, woven as it is into our daily life, as well as our history, politics, civic life, and the visions of our future for our families and our communities. So perhaps that brings us back to the starting point of Quay Molina. The whole is more than the sum of the parts, and the whole is in all of the parts. And today's discussion, or over the next few days, balances it is between technical, creative, cultural, political challenges and possibilities is fundamentally about how we care for each other and the meaningful places we live in. In other words, it's about culture. So with that, please join me in welcoming Deb Chachra to the stage. Thank you.
I think this is live. Okay. I'm really honored and grateful to be welcomed here. I want to thank Tony for that sort of wonderful welcome to the sort of ancestral and present and future homeland of the indigenous peoples here, and to Seb for the invitation and the organizations that made this possible, and then to Dan for that wonderful introduction. I was thinking as I was there, and this sort of full house, and it's like, I have to say, I'm kind of impressed at all of you who got up first in the morning to go hear an engineering professor, and all you know is that she's an engineering professor, to come and give a talk. I mean, it's kind of cool for me to be like, I get to talk to the arts and culture people. So I have to say, I'm deeply impressed, and I appreciate your trust in me that you came out this morning to hear me talk. So this is me a few years ago. On a weekend, some friends of mine and I walked the length of the LA River. And and in this, you can sort of see a bunch of the things that I've been sort of focused on for the last, some ways all my life, in some ways the last kind of 5 to 10 years. The LA River itself, which moves water through the city. You can see there's some shipping containers on the side. You can see sort of transportation and water. You can't see, but of course there's a cell phone in my pocket. All of these infrastructure systems. So as an engineering professor, I think a lot about technology, and my favorite hands-down definition of technology is this one from the science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin, that technology is how a society copes with physical reality, right? How they get and keep and cook food, clothe themselves, what their power sources are, what they build with and what they build, and so on. She says technology is the active human interface with the material world. And Ursula Le Guin, being who she is, every one of those sentences, every one of those words is important in that sentence. And that's really when I think and talk about technology today, we're not thinking about sort of the high-tech stuff. We're like really into this very basic stuff. And as I said, mostly my focus is infrastructure. You know, I went and I looked at like where Melbourne got its water from, and the answer is these 10 beautiful reservoirs and the catchment areas that they're attached to. So I think about water. This is my slightly out of focus photo of my sewage treatment plant taken from the plane, leaving Logan. Includes things like transportation, includes electricity. And so I'm really kind of focused on these physical networks that what we think of them as utilities, right, that meet sort of our basic needs. And I just want to take a couple of minutes to actually talk about water as kind of a canonical example of this, because it kind of illustrates a few things. So this is the new Croton Dam. It's upstream of, it's up sort of the Hudson from New York City. And it was built because it turns out that anytime you have kind of a group of people together, everyone needs water every day. And if you have a bunch of people together, that becomes kind of acutely clear. But also, water flows downhill. So getting it to where it's going, it's like you could sort of like have it flow downhill. And the more people you have close together, the more acute the question of where you're getting water from becomes. And in fact, actually, it's worse than that, right? Because it's where you're getting clean water from. Because if you have many people close together, right, that becomes an issue too. And so pretty much, you know, over and over again in settlements, when people get close together, at some point someone realizes like, hey, you know that if we actually all get together and we build an aqueduct, some way of bringing water to where we are and distributing it, gravity will do most of the work for us. And we'll have access to clean water, and we can collaborate on this thing, and everyone who lives where we live will benefit from it. And it's actually even better, because it's not even like, oh, if you pay for it and you get it. It's like, no, actually, because of waterborne diseases, right, your family will be safer if the people around you are safe. It's really kind of the sort of definition of a public good. But part of the reason why I'm sort of talking about it in that kind of detail is because I want to highlight a few things. So one is, it really binds the people who are living in a particular place to each other and to the and to the land that they live on and to the future, right? You're sort of making this decision, we're going to make this giant investment to build things like this dam, and because we know that in the future everyone will sort of continue to benefit from it, right? And so that requires this kind of future thinking collaboration with the people around you, where you are in this sort of community or this settlement. And we kind of see this pattern over and over again for these sort of networked infrastructures, right? So very similar things are true for sewage, for electricity, even for things like the internet, for transportation. We see these sort of patterns over and over again, that it matters where you live and kind of who's around you. So Amartya Sen, who's an economist, said, he was a developmental economist. He studied the sort of the poorest people in the world. And he said, we have excellent reasons for wanting more income or wealth. He says, it's not because they're desirable for their own sake. And in fact, for people who find income and wealth desirable for their own sake, like we recognize that there's something pathological in that, right? We want them because they're typically admirable general purpose means for having more freedom to live the kinds of lives that we have reason to value. Right? The usefulness is in the things that it allows us to do. It's the freedoms that it allows us to achieve. I think his book was named Development is Freedom, right? Getting at this idea of that that's what the purpose of money is. Economist. So I'm not an economist, I'm an engineer, but I am going to point out that one of the sort of simplest and most profound ways of seeing this is actually through artificial light, right? So if you think about how much of your day is possible because we have access to artificial light, that we can then choose to do what we want when we want to do it, whether it's because the sun has gone down or whether because we're in an inside room that has no other light, right? That has no natural light. And so I think of artificial light as kind of one of the purest forms of agency, right? That it actually having artificial light that we don't even think about, right? We're just like, you get up and you turn on the light, or you walk into your building and you turn on the light. That it enables us, it's a way of illustrating that one of the main things that we do is use wealth to get agency. And in fact, artificial light is like the first thing that people do when they have money, when they have any resources. And you can sort of track development by looking at light. But it is also the thing that we really do together, right? So it's like it is the killer app for electricity to basically make it possible for everyone to have artificial light. And again, having water on tap, having fuel for cooking, right? Having not having to deal with sewage. These are all the things that make it possible for us to do things like be here today, as opposed to dealing with these sort of very basic human needs. And we deal with them together. And so as Dan pointed out, we make kind of social decisions about how we want to do them. And they are shaped by our society, and I talk a lot about it in the book, and I'm actually not going to focus on it today about sort of how we get to it, because I want to focus on some more future-facing stuff. But I do want to say that the real thing that happened over the course of the 20th century is that all of these infrastructural systems basically grew out. They grew in size, and they grew in scale, and they grew in geographical extent. So this is the Hoover Dam near Las Vegas, which is gigantic, famously gigantic. We can think about the way electricity grids basically now cover continents, shipping containers, and the way that the flow of goods around the world is made possible by but basically this technological innovation of containerization, new forms of networks, so airplanes, right, and things like internet. So one of the things that it's worth sort of pointing out is one of the reasons why I actually start with water is because water flows downhill all by itself, right? If you sort of set things up correctly, you just sort of you sort of build the thing, and then the water will sort of move itself to where it needs to go. But almost everything else that I've discussed is powered by energy, right? It needs energy at the most basic level. It needs energy to happen, and that energy has to come from somewhere, and we are fairly sure where that energy comes from, right? So I think this is the only graph I'm going to show you, I promise. So this is a graph, but hopefully it's fairly straightforward. This is a graph of energy usage by all humans, right? Over you can see the timeline is from 1800 on. And so there's a couple of things I want to notice. So the red line, which is sort of traditional biomass, so burning things like wood, this graph starts at like 1800, but that red line basically goes back into prehistory, right? Like that's how we got sort of energy by setting things on fire, and typically wood. What changed is the Industrial Revolution and access to things like coal, and then oil, and then natural gas, right? And you can see the gray and the blue and the purple. And at the very top, you can see these sort of modern things like nuclear, wind, hydropower, wind, and so forth. So everything that sort of happened in the last 150 years is that we've started building out these systems that are powered by energy that give us an enormous amount of freedom in our daily lives to do the kinds of things we want to do, right? To do things that were pretty much impossible. And as someone who's a brown woman, right? Like most people who look like me, middle-aged brown women, most of their days today are still spent doing things like getting food for cooking or getting water, right? So the fact that is not what my life is like is really because of the access to energy. So, one of the things, the other thing I want to sort of highlight to you is the shape of this curve, right? That the total amount of energy that's being used by humans has increased pretty radically over the last 100 or so years. And it's what makes modern life as we know it possible, what allows us to do all of these things. And of course, the other piece of it is that it's not evenly distributed. So because most of the way in which we use energy is through those infrastructural systems, right? It's like, how do you get your electricity, or like, how do you move around, or like, what kind of telecommunications or communications do you use, and how do you heat your home, how do you cool your home, right? All of these are things that we have sort of mostly solved collectively through networks. And so what that means is it's highly dependent on where you live. So this is not, as you might think, a graph of per capita income. What this is a graph of per capita energy usage. And so I grew up in Canada, and you can see Canada and the United States, and you can see Australia is also quite dark red. They have a high per capita energy usage. And a bunch of this is, we move around a lot, and Canada is pretty cold. A chunk of it is that we get to do things like have lights and elevators, right? All of the things that are part of our life. And so the first thing I kind of want you to take from this is that the problem is not that we have access to energy, right? The problem is that, I'm going to go back, is that most of where the energy comes from, right? And so one of the ways in which I think about this is This is the million mile view. This is literally the million mile view. This is a picture of the Earth from the EPIC Discover satellite. It's at Lagrange point 1. It's in space about 1 million miles away from Earth towards the sun. The satellite actually always faces the Earth, so it's always in the same position, and it faces the sunny side of the Earth. And I actually love, I use this image on my talks because I love this image. So the thing about it is that there are two things that we can take from this image, right? So one is that the Earth is bathed in sunlight. And in fact, you can run the numbers, and if everyone on the planet uses energy at the same rate as Australians or Canadians, it's only a tiny, tiny fraction of the incident sunlight that's arriving on the planet. It's like 0.4% or something like that, right? So the problem has never been that we don't have access to energy. So if we're looking at what we want to do in the future, the question is not how do we reduce our energy usage, right? The question is how do we get our energy without setting things on fire? Which, when you put it that way, it's like that just seems like the dumbest way to get energy, right? And of course, the thing that has in fact genuinely changed in unprecedented human history has happened in my lifetime, in the lifetime of many of you who are here, not quite in the lifetime of my students, but close, which is that for the first time, we've actually figured out how to access renewable energy at scale, right? So this is the standard Danish windmill design that was invented. The other thing is the sort of commercialization, the commodification of solar panels. And these are kind of the two, marquee things for accessing renewable energy. They're of course not the only ones. And the way I think of it is not that this is the only way that we can do it. This is kind of the proof of concept that we have a pathway to a world where we get all of our energy without actually going through atoms, without setting things on fire, right? So, this, we have not, broadly as a society, I don't think we have fully wrapped our brains around this idea that we're now decoupling. We sort of understand that we need energy to have agency in the world, right? That fossil fuel companies are happy to tell you, without gas, you don't get to do the things that are important to you, like moving around, like staying warm. And what has changed is that equation of energy, you need energy to have agency, and that energy came from fossil fuels, right? So you need fossil fuels to have agency, and that's what's been split, right? So now it's possible to have energy without actually having fossil fuels. So that's the first thing that I kind of want folks to sort of think about what the sort of implications of that are. So I mentioned I grew up in Canada, and if you're paying attention, Dan mentioned in the sort of canned bio, buried at the bottom is I grew up from Toronto. So it's here on Lake Ontario. So Toronto is kind of sort of at the top. Niagara Falls is kind of on the underneath the sort of the horseshoe at the end, the Golden Horseshoe. It's about an hour and a half drive from Toronto to Niagara Falls, which is 120, 130 or so kilometers. And so at Niagara Falls, there are two hydropower stations, two hydroelectricity stations. So I took this photo standing in the one on the New York side, the New York Power Authority. No, it's the Robert Moses Power Authority. There's a whole story behind that. Standing on that at the visitor center, and I took a photo across the river and across the border to the hydroelectricity power station on the Canadian side. So that's the side in Ontario. It's owned by the Ontario Power Generation. It's publicly owned. And I mentioned I grew up in Toronto, and for a long time I actually lived almost in the shadow of this building. So this building is called Casa Loma, and you have to pronounce it really carefully because it means house on the hill, not Castle Oma, because you could be forgiven for thinking it's a castle. And I used to live really close to there. It's on top of a hill. It looks down over all of the city. People would walk out of the subway and they'd be like, "Where's Casa Loma?" And I'd be like, "Over there." And they'd be like, so it looms. I think to this day it is the largest private residence built in Canada. So it was built by this guy, Henry Pellet. And Henry Pellet was one of the financiers who was behind seeing Niagara Falls and saying, and it was kind of the birth of hydropower and hydroelectricity. And, Tesla and Edison had just figured out this idea of how do you move electricity around. And he was like, we can generate electricity using Niagara Falls, and we can now deliver it to Toronto where people will pay significant amounts of money for electricity. So So we did, right? So they built it out, and they started charging people for electricity. And so this guy on the right is a guy named Adam Beck. And Adam Beck was one of kind of the leading proponents of hydroelectricity, but specifically that hydroelectricity should belong to the public, right? That it should not be sort of privately funded or privately people benefit from it privately. And so he's had these sort of two slogans. If there's any Latin scholars here, please forgive my pronunciation. I went to public school in Canada, did not learn Latin. Dona natura pro populo sunt, the gifts of nature are for the public. Right, that Niagara Falls belong to everybody. And so if hydroelectricity was being made from it, right, that it belonged to the public. I actually like this very straightforward thing, power at cost. Right, so here's the fancy version, here's the real version, right, which is pretty much if you're building a giant freaking house that overlooks the city of Toronto, it's probably some pretty solid evidence that you're making more money than you really need to be making off the fact that people need electricity. I have to say, like, I feel like that's not a really good way to like advertise that you're being, you're demonstrating probity at providing this utility. And so, not terribly surprisingly, Beck was able to actually get sort of popular support to buy out the private electricity suppliers. And since then, this happened in like the 1906, I think, like before World War I, so kind of in the 1910 range. They sort of bought out all the electricity and made them public. And because basically it was like, here's this public good, right? We think that people should benefit from it, right? Without the idea of it being going to profit. So that power station is actually the Sir Adam Beck power station. It's named, to this day, it is named after that person. I can have a very, very short detour, which is that means that every time I see any version of this, right? Would you like to use AI to do that? I definitely think of it as the intermediate step between these two things. Right? It's like, it's an infrastructure play, right? It's like people who are like, if we can gate access to computation, then we have Niagara Falls or wherever we're getting our energy from, and whatever the negative impacts of that kind of on the other side, and then we're delivering you the sort of computational power, right? And then you can pay us for that. And so I definitely see there are many things we can talk about sort of AI, and I tend to think of it as computation, as a way of making computation into infrastructure. So the first thing I want to say is that it is possible. We've got to the point where all of our energy can come from things like, the equivalent of Niagara Falls, right? That all energy is renewable. That energy exists everywhere in the environment. It is decentralized. It is distributed. No matter where you live, you have access to it, right? So one sort of implication of that is that if we take this sort of like widely available power and we gate it, right, as opposed to making it something where it's like this is a public good, right, is a decentralized, distributed public good, we need to treat it that way, right? We will not actually get all of the benefits of having access to energy, right? Having access to the agency. And we notice it in places like Australia, but it's going to be even more profound in places that have never had access to significant amounts of power, right? So my family emigrated to Canada from India, so I'm sort of very aware of the sort of alternate timeline, right, world of that. So that's one implication, right? Thinking about it being public. The second implication is, so this is a photo of solar panels taken outside Hyderabad. And in fact, it was set up by a private company. But one of the things that the person who I spoke to, the head of the company, was talking about is the nature of so the nature of renewables is that they don't actually have to be centralized. And it's so weird. It's like, it actually has to do with thermodynamics. I promise you I will not get into thermodynamics. But it turns out that if you're like actually getting your energy from thermal generation, so by combustion or by nuclear power plants, to be more efficient, you really need it to be centralized. And that is not true for most renewables because it's not thermal generation, right? So they can be distributed in a way, they don't need to be centralized in the same way that thermal generation needs to be centralized. So if you think about like cities where like we used coal to generate electricity in the city and then we moved it away from the city so somebody else had to deal with the pollution, right? that model of you need a giant thing somewhere else isn't really true anymore. Because of the actual very technical nature of how renewables work. And we see this. This is why there are solar panels kind of everywhere. This is why you see kind of wind turbines kind of everywhere, right? That there's solid like economic reasons why people might want to centralize them, but there's the technical reasons for centralizing them that were true for things like coal plants don't exist anymore. So public, right? So we have access to it. And then really thinking about the implications of what it means if energy isn't coming from specific places, right? The geopolitics of energy not having to be like, where do we get our fossil fuels from? But instead being like, we just get our energy from the environment. And it could be wind, it could be hydro, it could be geothermal, it could be whatever is locally around you, right? It really changes the geopolitics of energy in a way that we haven't, again, it's one of those things which we're starting to think about. What does it mean to live in this world? What does it mean with to the geopolitics of it? So, back to this thing. So I said one of the things that you can see from this is that the Earth is bathed in sunlight, right? So we have an abundant amount of energy. The thing that has changed in our lifetime is that we can now harness it, right? And we're like thinking through the implications of that. So one of the implications of it is that we're not going to be able to make the most of it if it's not community owned, right? If it's investor owned. It's the second sort of implication of it is what does it mean that electricity is just everywhere on the planet, right? As opposed to being like you have to go to that particular hole in the ground that has a fence around it and you can pull an infinite amount of energy out of it. And so people are interested in protecting that spot with guns, right? Which is ultimately one way of thinking about fossil fuels and the geopolitics around fossil fuels. But the second thing that you can see from this photo is arguably even more profound, which is that the Earth is hanging in the void of space, right? There is, to a first approximation, nothing comes in or out, right? There's the odd meteorite coming in, there's the odd like spacecraft going out, but like broadly, we live, it's a biosphere, right? It's a closed system, right? So energy is coming in every moment of every day, but matter, right? Every atom that gets used, it basically has to come from somewhere and it has to go somewhere, right? And we are now kind of living in the consequences of this, right? It's most obvious when you think about climate change. If you think about climate change, there's like an energy problem, which is where we're getting our energy from, but there's also an atoms problem, right? A matter problem, which is that we're pulling fossil fuels out of the ground and we're turning them into, we're taking the energy off incredibly inefficiently, but we're taking the energy off by burning them. And then those CO2 molecules are now going into the air, right? And so into the atmosphere. And so the idea was always like, you could just keep putting them in the atmosphere, right? Nothing bad's going to happen. It'll just get diluted. And we're now a century and a half of like looking at that exponential curve later, right? We know that that's not true, right? The fact that those atoms we would rather them not be in the atmosphere. They are now in the atmosphere. We can no longer ignore the problem, right? We can no longer ignore the fact that they're in a different place than they were before. And this is simplistic but also useful, right? I think of the environment as actually, when we think about, oh my God, everything in the environment is terrible, there's actually two separate problems, right? One problem is where are we going to get our energy from? And we've kind of got that, right? That's kind of a foregone conclusion, right? We know how to do it. The economics are so good, right? Because you don't have to pay. I mean, the reason why Pellet looked at Niagara Falls for like power is because he knew that he did not have to pay for like he didn't have to pay for a lump of coal for like every bit of electricity that came out, right? He was like, once you build it, you don't have to pay that incremental increase. And now, potentially, all power, right, all of the energy we use can be that, right, where you don't have to pay for it on a per joule basis. You have the operating costs, the distribution costs, but that like one-on-one increment marginal cost doesn't have to be true. But then, of course, the other issue with the environment is what I think of as the atom problem, right? Is the matter problem, which is that we don't just need energy to do things in the world, we use matter, right? We need matter to build these out. Dan talked about the issue of if we replace every internal combustion car with an EV, right? That's clearly ridiculous. I live in the United States, right? It's even more ridiculous, right, to envision doing that. I think of it as kind of the sort of standard math or engineering thing, like what is the limiting case, right? And you can say, imagine that you replaced every internal combustion engine, right, car with an EV. That would solve the energy problem, but you would be so obviously deeply in the hole, right? Like all of Connecticut would be covered with junked cars, right? If you didn't actually address the atom problem, right? And so the next kind of point that I want to make is the thing that is interesting and unprecedented about energy is what do we do when we have access to way more energy than we've had before, right? So imagine if all energy is in the realm of sort of like Niagara Falls, right? Instead of fossil fuels, you don't have to pay someone for using it. You just have to build a system to access it. What does that mean? And to me, the most profound and interesting thing is for it to change our relationship with matter. And so this is actually, this is from the Rural Electrification Administration. So this is when the electrical grid was built out over all of the United States between the two World Wars. But to think about that, I'm actually going to like go back to the 19th century. So the thing on the left, the fancy looking thing, is a baby rattle that was made for Emperor Napoleon III's new infant son in 1856. The part that looks like silver is aluminum, because in 1856, aluminum was a precious metal, right? It was a beautiful light silvery metal, right? It's like, of course, it's the ideal thing to make a baby rattle out of, right? It's light, it doesn't corrode, it's silvery. Like, of course, that's where you want to make it out. And it's also super fancy and super expensive. So aluminum is not precious because it's rare, right? Aluminum is precious, or was in 1856, because aluminum binds so tightly to oxygen that even though it's everywhere, it mostly just exists as aluminum ore, right? And in fact, that's actually one of the reasons why aluminum, once it's corroded, doesn't keep corroding. Like basically, you have a film on the surface, it binds that oxygen, and then nothing touches it. So that aluminum was discovered really late because of this, right? And it's an intrinsic characteristic of aluminum that it's always going to take a lot of energy to separate the atoms from the aluminum atoms as metal from the ore. And of course, this is one of the things where Amartya Sen is an economist, and he thinks in terms of money. I'm an engineer, and I think in terms of energy, right? And then almost everything, when you say something costs too much money to do, usually what it means is it takes too much energy to do that, and you have to pay for the energy, right? And so if you think about a lot of economics of like, does it really cost too much money, or does it actually just take too much energy, right? Changes things. So the two gentlemen who are imaged here, Charles Hall, who's an American, and Paul Héroult, who is French, in 1886, they were both 22, which is one of the weirdest cases of like convergent invention. Both figured out how to isolate aluminum from its ore using electricity, right? Using an electrolytic process. So it's 1886, we can now do it kind of commercially with electricity. 1886, electricity was kind of not a thing, right? It existed, we knew it existed. We did not have it in any kind of large scale quantity. But then, right, over the course of the next little while, things like the Green New Deal happened, and we built out hydroelectric dams and had access to much greater amounts of energy. And that meant that it was possible to build out things like aluminum smelters. And in fact, this, at least in the US, has got a real push from using aluminum for planes in World War II, right? So basically there was a very, very strong societal incentive to build out. We have the technology, right, which is the Hall-Héroult process. We have the energy because we've built out all of these dams during the New Deal, the original New Deal. And now we have the kind of reason to do it, which is we want to build lots of aluminum planes for the war, right? So there was a real drive to build out these smelters. So this is an aluminum smelter. My background is in material science and metallurgy because I went to school in Canada, so my school was a extraction-based program. And the first time I saw a picture, so I knew what these looked like because I saw my fellow grad students showing pictures of them. The first time I saw a picture of the Dales, the Google data center in Oregon, my first thought was like, that looks like an aluminum smelter. And then I realized it was like, oh, right, because it needs kind of the same things, right? It needs access to water, access to a huge amount of cheap electricity, right? And access to good ways of moving things around, right? Good supply chains. But this is an aluminum smelter. And so we know what happened, right? So having access to a bunch of energy, having access to technology meant that aluminum went from a thing you use for the baby rattles for the Empire's new infant to something that is literally disposable, right? So that basically that energy was used to like ramp up extraction and then consumption, and then it gets discarded, right? And to be fair, aluminum is actually recycled pretty well. Aluminum, steel, and glass are the three things that are actually recycled in reasonable quantity, because it takes so much energy to make it in the first place. It does take so much less energy to reuse it, right? That there's an economic incentive, there's an energy incentive to reuse it. So this is the thing that the state we're kind of at, though, right? Which is the last time we got access to a whole bunch of energy, the thing we did was kind of supercharge extraction. The thing that we can potentially do is use it to close materials loops, right? Is to use it to actually figure out how to use all of the materials that we've already used. If you want to make anything with plastic, there's like mechanical recycling where you melt it and reuse it. But mostly there are so many different kinds of plastic that one of the ways in which you can use it is you can burn it. And so here's the thing. If you can burn it to break it down into the atoms that it's made out of, and you can get heat out of it, if you want to go in the other direction, right? If you want to go from like, we have these atoms and we want to turn them into plastic, right? Or if you want to take, say, CO2 out of the atmosphere, right, and turn it back into some kind of solid, it will always, always, always take a huge amount of energy to do that, right? If you can burn it and get heat in one direction, if you want to go in the other direction, you need to put that energy in. But if that energy is coming, and clearly you would never do that with fossil fuels, right? It's like, why would you burn fossil fuels to recycle plastic when obviously you can just pull out more fossil fuels, right, to make more plastic, which is the world that we've been living in for the last half a century. But it's now possible to say, well, if we have access to energy, we don't need to pay for energy in that way. Suddenly, it becomes possible to conceive of doing the opposite of this, right, of closing these materials loops. So to get there, this is Atasha Cave, and to get there, we need, of course, the technology to do it. The whole idea of closing materials loops, doing this kind of cradle-to-cradle thing, has suddenly been possible in a way it's never been possible, because we now understand that we can get energy at scale without passing through combustion. And there are many, many, many people who are working really hard to figure out the thing that Holland Hero did, which is like, you need to actually have the technology for how to do it. So this is Atasha Cave. There are many stories. I like the story because she was in my very, very first class I ever taught as a professor in material science. And she went and she did her PhD at Stanford. She figured out a catalyst that allows you to go from carbon dioxide back to things like long-chain polymers. So that includes like fuels, but also includes plastics. And so the idea is, can you pull CO2 out of the air, put in a huge amount of energy from renewable sources, and use it to turn back into something that's useful, right? So this is not a thing that would have been possible if it wasn't that renewable energy makes it economically feasible. But we still need to figure out the technology for how to do it, which is, of course, what she worked on. But the real bigger thing is that we have to decide that this is the thing that we want to do, right? Because this isn't well, you can make it and then sell it, right? This is a whole new thing. So this is kind of one of the next kind of key points that I kind of want folks to take home. These three things, right? Access to all of the energy that we need to allow for agency for everyone worldwide, right? The fact that that energy is distributed and decentralized, right? That it's not sort of gated, that access isn't gated. And really importantly, the fact that that energy can then be put to work dealing with the matter problem, right? Figuring out how to close these loops, right? The dream is that every ICE, it's like, the beating swords into the plowshares, right? Like everything that gets decommissioned then gets basically pulled apart and then used to make the next thing, right? As opposed to having to dig new things out of the ground. And as I said, I know there's, groups who are working on this for lithium. I know that, this idea, the very sort of basic idea is like, well, there's probably better ways to do it, but minimally you can burn plastic to carbon dioxide and hydrogen and then pull that back in the other direction, right, to make the new thing, right? All of this is like, what is possible once we realize that we can close materials loops But then what does it take for us to decide that this is the thing we're going to do? And so this Ursula Franklin is in fact a material scientist. She was a professor emerita, and this is part of her book, The Real World of Technology. She said, in any new order that can shape and direct technology and human destiny, which is really what we're talking about here, right? This is the thing that has never existed in human history. What do we do with it, right? It's going to be this emphasis on the concept of justice, that we're going to need to start making decisions about how are we going to do it in a way that limits harms? How are we going to do it in a way that limits negative externalities, right? How are we going to do it in a way that is fair and just to everyone, right? Recognizing that it's possible, which is I personally think it's kind of amazing. It's mostly why I'm here talking to you about it today. But actually figuring out how to implement it is a whole different story. But it is not unprecedented, right? So, the nature of activism is to say, this is the world we live in, and we want to live in a future that is different than the one that that's being shared with us, right? It's about having a sort of a dissenting vision of what that future could be and wanting to build that future, right? All activism is like looking at a future and basically saying, I want that to go in a different direction, right? How do we collectively decide that we want that to go in a different direction? Right? And activism has, of course, always been really closely linked with art. I don't know how many folks are here are old enough and to remember this. This is the Sydney Olympics. When Men at Olin came out wearing these shirts that said sorry. So the sort of link between art and activism has been real, but it's this idea of seeing the world we're in, seeing a world in the future, and basically deciding, how do we want to build that world? That is not the province of engineers, broadly. Engineers kind of build what they're told to build by everyone else. What it really is the product of us as a society to start thinking about what these worlds might be. So I really love this Brian Eno quote. And so Eno said, the job of art is to present you with other worlds, right? And the process of engaging with them is saying, I'm going to live in that world for a little bit. I'm going to exist and see what it feels like to be in that world. And that to me is the most important thing that we do really as humans. We probe the possibilities for the future and for alternative locations and so on by living in them in a model, in a simulated form. And so in this quote, Brian Eno actually talks about reading 1984, and he's like, I read 1984, now I have a sense of what it feels like to live in 1984. And I'm going to sort of submit that we do this, but there's a really strong dystopia bias to the media we make. I have to say, this, for those of you who don't recognize it, this is Mad Max Fury Road. This is a perfect movie. This is one of my all-time favorite movies. I love this movie. This is the vision of futures that we often get, right? This is for those of you who haven't seen it, first of all, go see it. Secondly, this is the warlords basically control the water for people, right? And we instantly understand that having water controlled by someone else and not made freely available to people who need it is like a dystopia, right? Like we know that this is bad. There's no question, right? There are pretty much, many, many, many forms of science fiction, near future stories, where the near future is our infrastructural systems or things that are sort of common pool things are gated, right? So it's like you don't have access to water, you can't breathe the atmosphere, you don't have access to power, and so forth, right? So we are really good at telling stories of the future where there is conflict around infrastructure, conflict around these basic human needs, because that makes for really great blockbuster movies, right? You know what does not make for good blockbuster movies? Futures of like peace and abundance and justice and resilience, and agency globally, right? And so we don't really have a lot of practice, right, at seeing and creating those worlds. We do have a lot of practice with activism. We do have a lot of practice with art and seeing other worlds. So this is a quote. This is actually from Andy Brown, who's a friend of mine. And she talks about setting intentions as far-fetching. And she says, it's like you take something that's far away and you bring it up close and you can look at it and figure it out, right? And she says, instead of wishing for a different future, far-fetching invites you to haul that future into the present, in bits and pieces if that's what it takes, right? It trades an empty hand for one with a grip on what's possible, that all you have to do is pull. And so I'm teaching a course on speculative design to my engineering students this year. And the question I'm asking them is to really engage with the possibility of building out these futures, right? Building out a future where energy is abundant, where we've used it to close materials loops, right? All of these things that are technologically possible in a way that they haven't been, right? In a way that we haven't, as I said, it's unprecedented in human history, in a way that we haven't fully grappled with. I'm saying, I understand, right? The issue is not how are we going to get there, right? But we need to start by genuinely engaging with the fact that these possible futures could exist. And so the main reason why I'm here talking to you all, right, is because I know that isn't the province of engineers, right? That isn't the thing that technologists do. That is a thing that all of us need to do, right? That all of us need to be activists, that all of us need to think about what the future can be, right? And what models of the future can be. And the shape that's going to take is going to be different. Like as I said, I showed Atasha and like the work that she's doing with polymers, and we need to do that for everything, right? It's like the shape that this is going to take is going to be different everywhere. I have one example that I want to share, which is something called livinginfrastructure.org. It's done by friends of mine at Spherical Studio about doing green infrastructure in LA. And it's a field kit, and the idea is that you can use this to sort of explore possibilities with your community. And the reason why I'm sharing it is not because it is like the thing, right? I'm sharing it because it is a thing, right? It is a thing that gets at that far-fetching idea of like, how do we pull bits of this future into the present so that we can actually take a look at it and turn it around and decide what we want to do and what we want to do differently. So, because I think the work that we're at, right, is this idea of having new narratives and new possibilities and figuring out how to build those worlds together, which is really different than we're trying to figure out how to either perpetuate the world we live in or how to basically stop bad things from happening, right? And so this is that, envisioning a world that has never existed, right? Envisioning a thing that we have no experience with, right? That is really the province of arts and culture, right? It's not the province of technology. So I think I'm going to wrap things up there. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And we have time for questions.
Indeed. Have a seat. So, see a QR code up there. I've been led to believe, and apologies if it takes you to some dodgy e-shopping site, but that should be a Slido link for you to pose questions to Deb, and in theory they'll end up on this iPad, and in theory I'll look at that.
We'll do it.
And I'll try to remember to look at that and fold in some of your questions. So please do go there, add a question. I'll get it in the list here, and I'll try and incorporate it. Deb, thanks for that. That was amazing and far-reaching, and somehow did connect these questions of aluminium and Napoleon III's rattle and dam projects and vast public works, and you brought it both down to the ground of everyday life, but also again sort of culture in both of those senses, everyday life, but also things like Mad Max Fury Road, which I also love as an amazing film.
I don't want to live there.
No, well, I was going to say, I reckon let's start with, I've got a bunch of questions, but one of them might be another movie, maybe around the same time, which, for all of the other things going on in the film, does portray an innovative city that's high-tech, based around social justice, and that's Wakanda in Black Panther, and the production designer Hannah Beekler on that, working obviously with the crew that did amazing work in describing the details of, in a way, everyday life. You see glimpses of it in the movie, and it is, in theory, super sustainable because of this, what's it called? Vibranium, I think, the made-up element that's at the core of that technological program.
Unobtainium is the classic science fiction way of describing that.
Exactly.
Right.
So on two things. One is predicated on a material that doesn't exist,
right,
but it's a film, so fine.
Yeah.
Secondly, Wakanda is a sort of a closed-loop system. In a way, it's sort of a microcosm of the broader planetary system, which you describe, as in it's deliberately separated
Yeah.
in a way. But
Yeah.
other than that,
Like within the sort of closed, like Earth is a closed system.
yeah,
Right? They're like, we're going to be a closed system within that.
yeah. But it is a sort of progressive, positive vision. But I'm struck by it. Probably feels to me, I don't know how you feel about that. I'm guessing you've seen it, but it feels a bit like a new public deal type thing, as in this is vast infrastructure done by scientists and engineers and technologists, kind of behind the magic curtain, and then everything works. And then the city's beautiful, and there are wonderful street scenes full of life and culture and so on. So I suppose one thing, do you see that in the same way? And then secondly, what you were getting at, though, I think, was energy now is distributed, not centralized, and is much more immediate, and it's not hidden. And we can get into that a bit and why we might both think that. But it's no longer just behind a switch on the wall there, and none of us in this room, I imagine, have any idea where the energy comes from behind that switch. I'm guessing, maybe someone does. But it's probably a long way away.
It's almost certainly a long way away.
In a big centralized system, knowing Victoria, probably a coal-fired power plant. So, but we don't think about that.
Right. And by design.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of the same in Wakanda, as far as I could tell. So we didn't really think about, is there another way of doing energy? So do you see that vision in that way? Again, it's more positive and progressive, but it's still energy is done by someone else for you. And other ways that we could start thinking about, well, how do we make this other vision come alive, where energy and other infrastructures are things that we're actively engaged in, co-owning, we're making ourselves.
Yeah, so like per the sort of unobtainium point, right? Like one of the things I kind of want to stress is that everything that I talked about today is like is mundane, right? It's like mostly these are things that have either been solved or like we have a solution. It's probably going to be replaced by different solutions, but there's no unobtainium involved, right? There's nothing where it's like we're still figuring this out. I used to think that writing, the line that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago and the second best time is today. Yeah. That's kind of how I thought about the book, right? The best time to have written it was 20 years ago. And then I realized, but if I'd written it 20 years ago, I would say, in the future, we will have figured out how to do this, right? Which is really different than saying, like, we've actually now figured out how to do it, right? So that's kind of the first thing. Like, setting aside that sort of unobtainium piece of it, I think there's a real tension, and this is the tension, which is that part of the reason why infrastructure works the way it does and lets us do things is that we don't have to think about it, right? Is that it is it's infra, right? It's below. We very deliberately arranged it so that on a day-to-day basis, you do not have to do anything other than turn the tap or like flick the light switch. The way we've managed to do that broadly is by putting it further and further away from the point of use, and specifically putting not so much the generation, but the harms from it away. So like, both of us have lived in London, right? So the giant coal plants, one of which is now the Tate Modern, basically got shut down because the pollution in London was so bad. And it was like, let's just move these coal plants outside the city, right? And then move the electricity so we get to benefit from the electricity, but we don't have to deal with the coal pollution, right? And we've seen that sort of pattern over and over again. So part of the thing about having the energy being localized, right, having it generated where you are, is essentially saying we are going to mitigate the harms in a way that means that we can have it right here, right? And because that's the other pattern, right, that the people who are making the decisions very rarely take the decisions to take on the harms. Cars might actually be the big example, the big counterexample, right, where the harms of having a car, many of them accrue to those directly around the cars. Yep. And or even, like you in a car with traffic, right? Yeah. So, but broadly, the pattern has always been, can we push the harms away? And what renewable energy makes possible is because many of the harms are now mitigated, right? It means you can have them embedded among you again, right? Where you get to say, we get the benefits and we deal with like actually having them again. Yeah. And that opens up new possibilities, and the big one is actually resilience, right? Is that all, and a thing I didn't talk a lot about, but all of these networks that go through the landscape, that landscape is changing because of climate change, right? That's why things, if there's wildfires, there's blackouts, or if there's droughts, or if there's floods, right? That like change, even well-designed systems aren't going to work. And so the other piece of centralizing it is saying, okay, if we can deal with the harms, right, then, and we do it kind of locally, then we are way more resilient in a changing climate,
Mm.
right? So that's the sort of second piece of it.
So how do there's this pattern here we see around this kind of infrastructure with mobility, maybe switching from big trucks on large freeways and large cars on large freeways down to also sort of decentralized distributed systems,
Right.
E-bikes, cargo bikes, et cetera, et cetera.
And like
You sort of-
nodes.
with energy, the same potentially with water, although water seems to have a certain kind of economy of scale in terms of catchment, I guess.
Right, yeah.
But
So
so what that does is all of these things pull back to everyday life. So to make this, again, real, if we talked about the plug point in the corner.
yeah,
So say we're in an apartment block and you're in one apartment, I'm in another, I know Seb's in another apartment. In solar cells on the roof, batteries in the basement. You could begin to imagine, in Australia at least, where we have the highest number of solar cells on rooftops in the world, that going effectively kind of off-grid in the city. And that's kind of interesting culturally, because we're usually thinking of off-grid by the seaside or in a forest or in the bush. And so it's kind of out of the wider systems. This one's potentially in a suburb like Brunswick or something. So that isn't no longer then it's no longer just the utility sort of engineering question, right? Because then if you use up all the energy because you've been watching Mad Max all afternoon, and then I want to make some pasta, and I literally can't because you've taken all the energy out of the battery.
right.
That's then a social, cultural interaction question, isn't it? It's no longer just, the blockchain will be shuffling the electrons around to make sure that doesn't
Yeah,
happen.
and actually, I'm going to push back
okay.
a tiny bit, which is that, the reason why, I'm an engineering professor. I could totally get a house that has that's off the grid, right? And it's like, oh my God, like the last thing I want to do is like have to spend my days like dealing with like
wrangling electricity,
right? And it's like that's literally what every female ancestor in my basically that's what they did. Like I don't want to do the high tech version of that, right? I want to do fun things like this. But so like if you take I don't want to do it at the house level, and you're talking about kind of doing it at the neighborhood level, and right now we have it at a much larger level. And I think the bit that you're kind of missing there is that microgrids. What makes it a microgrid is that it can be independent, but it doesn't have to be independent.
So you can
right, and really what you want is you want federated microgrids that are connected to each other, and so it would look like any other grid, right? It would just be like, the electricity comes from there. You don't kind of need to know that it's coming from the solar panel on your roof or it's coming from your batteries, and it might not be. Electrons are fungible, right? But if something happens, if there's like a power failure, even if you just want to like do repairs, right? You could be like, okay, you're just going to be your microgrid for the next 2 days is going to be cut off. And so just this is the time you don't watch Mad Max all afternoon because people need energy for food. Right? So that's the space that we're navigating. Right? Is that we're sort of in this world where we have these giant centralized systems, and it's pretty easy for us to see I have my house, right? And I have my F-150 electric. That is my battery when there's a blackout and it goes down. I do not have an F-150, by the way. It's a truck.
I believe that's
it's the most
popular car.
Most popular truck in the United States. And there's now an electric version of it, and I'm fairly convinced that people are getting them because they actually serve as really good battery backups. But if you network them together, right, you have a smart grid made out of people's F-150 batteries, right? And is it my preferred way to do that? No. Like, will I take it? Yes, right? If people have energy resilience because they have trucks that have batteries in their driveway. And so that's the bit that I feel like we're not good at thinking about, which is, right, is that scale that isn't the Little House on the Prairie, like homestead scale, and that isn't the somebody else takes care of it entirely scale, but that networked, federated scale.
Yeah, which is arguably community scale, neighborhood scale, district scale.
Absolutely.
Or, that sort of middle ground. So one of the questions here sort of gets at that in terms of, there's lots of social theory about that. You can go back to the early 70s of Ivan Illich and convivial technologies and E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful and so on, which might be worth looking at again, I guess now. But these decentralized, distributed, community scale, neighborhood scale, coming back to arts and culture is our sort of, it's our vehicle for imagining shared futures. It's one of the most powerful things we can do is to imagine together a collective future for a place like Melbourne, let's just say that. And so do you find there's a role, specifically in the conversations you have about infrastructure? Let's just have that energy discussion we just played out. But how can arts and culture intercept that or augment that in some way, if it's not to be run just by, let's say, engineering professors, with all due respect? You're an exception. And or economists, or the policymakers in the State Electricity Commission here. Like in Australia, to be super clear, like the State Electricity Commission discussions about the shape of Australia or Victoria's infrastructure is not that affected by the arts and culture community. I would want it to be.
Right.
But like, how can those things be connected? The kind of vision-making, shared imagination stuff, collective imagination, with these decisions about collective infrastructures?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question, right? That as the person coming from the other side, I don't have the answer to.
That's
the
right.
thing that
We've got 3 days to figure it out.
That's right. We can work on it together for sure. I think to me, like a huge piece of it is that I think that policy change often follows social change.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not totally like all social change happens in your policy. It's like you have some like social change that happens, and there's a critical mass, right, where people start living their life differently, and that basically pushes the policy change, and then the policy basically then continues to push it in that direction, right?
You get this feedback loop,
right? And I think about I think even things like quitting smoking, right, or like smoking policy. In the museum, there's stuff about Australia's advertising, anti-tobacco advertising, right, where you make it less comfortable and people do it. So like I think that this piece of it is kind of in that space, right? Of like how do we get enough people to be like, oh, actually that world is a possible world, right? And like let's figure out how to advocate for that. Let's figure out how to work for that, right? That will hopefully then drive policy. Rather than going and sitting down with the policymakers. But in reality, I think it's going to happen everywhere all at once, right? And it's like, the piece of it's like, oh, it is possible to live in this kind of world, right? And this is what it looks like for your neighborhood, right? That's what the living infrastructure was, a slice of that, right? There's, it's like, oh, my friend got solar panels on his roof, and like now they basically never worry about electricity, right? And it's like, oh, well, what can you do that? It's like, but I don't want to have my own. How can we do stuff for neighbors? There's various programs I can think of that are happening at neighborhood scale that are highly locally specific. Like the one I can think of is about heat in New England, right? Which is going to be different than the one here. And
so that kind of, I mean, you talk very powerfully about this kind of also combination of activism and community organization, and I guess what I'm getting at is to start seeing these are connected decisions. Again, to be super literal, we wouldn't just have, say, Creative Australia trying to single-handedly fund all the arts and culture. We would have the Future Made in Australia Act, Energy Australia. You'd have these other huge infrastructure programs which have a budget 1 billion times more. That's not a literal number than Creative Australia, but it's a large number more. They would also be commissioning potential visions of here's how a small community outside Geelong could be living in the near future. That could be done through artwork, community work, community artwork. It could be done through speculative design and so on. Do you see that emerging anywhere, this kind of investment in possible futures? Outside, because arts and culture sometimes feels like it's on a back foot, just trying to get a seat at the table where these otherwise huge decisions are being made about culture.
Right. So I did some work in Malmö, Sweden, with a group there called Media Evolution, and the thing that they very explicitly did was looking at futures of the built environment. Got a science fiction, put together scenarios, got a science fiction writer to write stories about them, Paul Graham-Raven, if you know him, and then had teams build models to invite the city in to look and see the sort of instantiated models of what a sustainable, equitable future for Malmö could look like. This town, this city in southern Sweden. That's the first one that comes to mind because I happen to be involved with it, right? But I know there's like 24 microgrid programs in Victoria, right, where people are starting to be like, oh, this is the thing that's possible. I'm trying to think of other.
No, that's okay. I think
it's kind of both things happening, right?
They are, and they're sort of. I guess maybe my last question, which was someone else is getting at.
Oh, I see the red zero.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very quickly though is. Having worked in the Swedish government, I always hate to end on a Swedish example. if we come to Australia, Canada, the US, you know intimately well, though there's a question here about, how do we do the complexity of this futures thinking in countries which are largely captured, arguably, by fossil fuel-based interests in all three of those large countries. They are that. So I'm not asking you to solve that, but do you have a sense of parallels between US and Canada and Australia in this respect? Are there things that could be exchanged, whether it's to do with indigenous cultures, as we've talked about, or community activism, or neighborhood scale retrofits, or maybe the LA story is a good example?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the nature of this work is that it is not very legible. Right, so I can think of like specific examples, right? And I showed a picture of the Hoover Dam, right? Even before it was built, the Hoover Dam was going to be like a major tourist destination, right? It's this idea of like this single giant centralized thing. In the previous presidential administration, there were two major. This is the U.S. scenario, right? There's two major acts. The Inflation Reduction Act and the Build Back Better Act. And together they funded, and this is a solid 10 times more than I thought it was going to be, 55,000 grants, right, for local projects.
Amazing.
And so I know someone who lives in the Pacific Northwest, and they got a new electric ferry.
Yeah.
Right? And like that means nothing for like, they're like, they live in an island off. So they had presumably an oil or a gas ferry that got replaced with this electric ferry. That means nothing to you if you live in Sacramento, right? If you live in like a place in the desert.
Yeah.
And so the nature of this stuff is that it can only be done, it's really only visible like at the local level.
This is the downside of sort of local engagement.
Right.
I mean, it does occur to me that that's also something that arts and culture isn't very good at, is transposing and translating between places.
Right, but what it is really good at is that local, right? That local situated, this is what's happening in our community.
Yeah. Okay, so there is a big flashing zero there, which means we're out of time. So yeah, I'll give you all a chance to thank Deb in a minute. So there's a couple of just quick announcements, but I think that's a very nice place to end it in terms of understanding. In Australia, at least, we have a big Future Made in Australia policy. It would be interesting to think about the Future Made in Australia involving arts and culture far more profoundly than it currently is. It's not seen in that way, but I think Deb's talk weaves all of these things together and just makes very clear that they are connected at every single scale. So, well, maybe let's have a round of applause for Deb now. Why not?
Thank you.
Thank you. You can do another one in a second, but I was just going to say, we're going to get back on the program. We're going to take a break shortly. Before you all head off for a break, I just want to say you can grab a coffee and a snack from the Cafe Kiosk downstairs, which is next to the bathrooms on level 1. Please be back in your seats by 11:05, because we'll have the Minister for Creative Industries, the Honourable Colin Brooks MP, there, bang on the dot, as ministers are. So please be back for that. If you want to see more of Deb, there's a talk on Saturday afternoon, which I'll also be part of, with Justin O'Connor, who wrote an amazing book called Culture is Not an Industry, which is interesting. I just said Minister for Creative Industries. Anyway, Justin's book's very good as a sort of an alternative view of that, and also we'll be weaving together again, the three of us, culture, infrastructure, cities, everyday life, etc. That's 2 p.m. on Saturday. There's other great stuff happening on Saturday and Friday and Thursday, and indeed today. Thanks from me. You can all go, but thanks once again to Deb Chachra.
Thank you. Thank you.